This year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds and fiery dragons flying across the sky. These tremendous tokens were soon followed by a great famine, and not long after, on the 6th day before the Ides of January in the same year, the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island by rapine and slaughter.
So read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles the entry for the year 793 AD. Recorded here was the murder of defenceless monks and the plundering of St. Aidan's revered monastery of Lindisfarne. Pagan warships had fallen upon the island without warning, committing atrocities that appalled the Christians of Northumbria. But it was more than this that the chronicles recorded. It was the emergence of a new threat to the beleaguered kingdoms of Dark Age Europe, one that had come to terrorize, rob, and kill their peoples. It was the beginning of a new age, the age of the Vikings. Why the Vikings burst upon the scene at the end of the 8th century in such violent and sudden fashion can never be wholly explained. Even the origin of the name Viking is obscure, and its meaning can be ambiguous. Vikings were defined less by where they came from than by how they behaved. Vikings came from Scandinavian countries, but not everyone from Scandinavia was a Viking. A Viking was distinguished by his actions, and the most visible of these was piracy and raiding. But exploration, colonization, and trading were to be just as central to the Viking ethos.
It's difficult to find single explanations that explain the Viking Age. Certainly medieval writers talked about overpopulation in Scandinavia, land shortage, and Icelanders, for example, thought that their ancestors had left Norway because of the tyranny of the Norwegian king Harald Finehair. Monastic writers thought that it was God's punishment on the sinful people of Western Europe.
It could be that the population is expanding, and it could be that people are therefore, or at the same time, aware that there is somewhere else to go and live, and that it's possible for them to do this. There's also connections with trade. None of these are really conclusive. The most important one, I suppose, really is their seeking loot. The fact that there are these important people in Scandinavia who are warriors, essentially, or are kings, and they are trying to get hold of goods which they can then use themselves to reward their followers when they go home. However, clearly that's not the only thing which is going on, because there's also a whole series of, if you like, peasant migrations which follow on behind this.
By the 8th century, the Vikings possessed the technology to hit foreign coastlines hard and fast, almost with impunity. The Viking longboat has become an almost mythical weapon of war. With their sleek lines and high prows, decorated in pagan imagery including the famous dragon's heads, the Viking longboat is unmistakable. In open sea, it sailed under the power of a single large square sail. Upriver, it was powered by anything between 26 and 70 oars, depending on the size of the vessel. Most longboats, usually made from oak, ranged from 60 to 90 feet in length, although the Viking Age would witness some giants, such as Long Serpent, the flagship of the Viking king Olaf Tryggvason, and Great Dragon, the flagship of the legendary Harald Hardrada.
The Viking longships were different because they could actually cross open sea, and this opened up a sort of huge area of ocean that previously hadn't been open. Most other vessels had to hug the coastline, so the ocean-going ship was a big advantage. Also, they had relatively shallow drafts, so they could beach very easily. They could travel in fairly shallow waters as well as across the ocean, so they were very versatile.
People in Scandinavia had always been using boats. Boats have been increasingly developed and become better and better from going on sea voyages over a long period of time. In the 9th century, you can see from Scandinavian boat burials that all of a sudden the boats seem to be getting significantly larger, I think. In particular, there are two well-known boat burials amongst them, one at Oseberg in Norway and Gokstad as well. Both of these boat burials have extremely large boats with an extremely broad hull, and again they have what we might call a very shallow draft. So you can see that these boats were designed to go in rivers as well as on the sea.
This mobility, both on the rivers and on the sea, gave Viking raiders the advantage upon which they absolutely depended: surprise. In the decade following the attack on Lindisfarne in 793, the Vikings returned to hit targets on the coastlines of the British Isles and the continent again and again. St. Columba's monastery on the island of Iona was attacked in 795, 802, and again in 806. Communities on the islands of Scotland and in the Hebrides, Shetlands, and Orkneys were particularly vulnerable. In 795, the first recorded attack was made upon Ireland, probably at Reitlin Island. Raids on the monasteries at Inishmurray and Inishbofin soon followed. The Welsh kingdoms suffered too, and monasteries at Carmarthen, Llancarvan, St David's and Llanwit were all attacked. Before the end of the 8th century, attacks were also recorded against the northern coastlines of the Carolingian Empire. By the scale of what was to follow, these early raids might be called sporadic, but for coastal communities in particular, it was an unnerving time.
Well, what the Vikings were after was loot. The Vikings wanted money, they wanted riches, and what they were going to do was take those riches back home, back to Denmark or Norway or wherever they were going, to invest in their own projects at home. So they wanted money. And the thing that you have to remember about Western Europe and Western Christendom in general is that a large amount of wealth is actually focused in the monasteries. Monasteries are private foundations. They're founded by princes, by kings, sometimes by bishops. They're founded by the great aristocrats. They cost an enormous amount of money, and so these monasteries are the focus of a great deal of loot. They're the focus of large numbers of economic resources, things like cattle, for example, or sheep. So you have the lower orders, which you can use for slaves. You can sell them in the slave market. You can take them home and use them as slaves yourself. The cattle you can take away and use yourself or sell on yourself, and the people, the rich people, you take away and you ransom them. And monasteries are these wonderful, isolated, outposts of wealth in Western Christendom.
Always, the Viking raids were rapid and ferocious. But they were probably not usually the bloodbaths of popular imagination. These early Viking raids were made by just a handful of longboats, with a total complement of a couple of hundred fighting men at most. They relied on speed, surprise, and terror to get what they wanted. The longboats would appear with little warning, and bands of heavily armed men would quickly descend upon the local communities. Typically, the locals would flee or seek some kind of arrangement with the Vikings that might save their lives, but little of their property. But if resistance was offered, the Vikings were quite capable of living up to their stereotype. In making an example of the brave, a raiding party might slaughter an entire village and burn it to the ground. When word spread of the atrocity, other villagers would take the lesson to heart. In the middle of the 9th century, Viking raids reached unprecedented levels. Viking fleets of up to 60 ships now prowled the coastlines of Western Europe, and attacks were made with greater force and confidence.
The most obvious reason for Viking raiding to intensify in the 830s, I think, is the fact that the Vikings now are aware of what's going on in Western Europe. They understand, for example, that there is civil war in the Frankish Empire. You see increasing amounts of kings' time spent trying to repel these raiders, increasing amounts of time trying to mobilise forces to try and get these people pushed out because the raiders are going further and further inland.
The Carolingian Empire, bereft of Charlemagne's leadership since his death in 814, was amongst those that felt the brunt of this new Viking onslaught. The empire was savaged by heavy raiding up the Seine Valley, against Rouen and Paris. In the Loire Valley, Nantes, Tours, Blois and Orléans were all attacked. So too was Bordeaux on the Garonne. Paris itself was attacked 3 times within 16 years. In 858, Vikings even captured the abbot of Saint-Denis, whom they ransomed back to Paris for an agreeable sum of gold. Further east, the coastlands of Frisia were subjected to the same terrors. Hamburg, Kentovik, and Dorestad all suffered blood and fire at the hands of Vikings.
In Carolingian Europe, there was conflict at this time between the sons of the emperor, and therefore the sons were unable to actually put up a united defence against the Vikings. The Vikings could actually exploit these divisions in local politics. We know, for example, that the Carolingians actually used the Viking armies as mercenaries too. So the intensification can partly be explained by conditions in the actual countries where the Vikings attacked. It also seems in the British Isles, for example, that the Vikings had probably established some kind of base in the Orkneys, the Hebrides, and this meant that it was actually easier for them to attack other parts of the British Isles too. So therefore there were more attacks.
In England, the chronicles record a stream of attacks against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with Kent particularly hard hit. In 839 alone, London, Rochester and Canterbury were all sacked by Vikings. In a score of skirmishes and small but bloody battles against the invaders, Anglo-Saxon armies won some notable victories. But just as often, local levies were cut to pieces or scattered by the Viking attack. In 843, the Vikings established a permanent base for themselves at Noirmoutier, a small island in the vastness of the Loire estuary. Until such bases were established, raiding had been predominantly a summer activity, and the longboats would return home for the stormy winter months. Now, Viking raiding was an all-year hazard for the people of the Loire Valley.
Suddenly the Vikings become a year-round menace, that up until that point the Vikings went home. They went home to Scandinavia, and for that time at least what you had was peace. And then you knew that when the days started getting longer, the nights shorter, that the Viking longships would appear again. When they start to overwinter, that's when you have a year-round problem.
They're not simply there for loot, they're there potentially for political conquest, and it shows they're really very, very confident about what they're doing as well. And that's something which perhaps we couldn't always have said beforehand. But certainly by the 840s and the 850s, when they're staying in England, they're staying in the Carolingian Empire, this really shows that they mean serious business and they're not just raiding.
The Vikings chanced their arm further afield. In 844, the Moors got their first taste of Viking violence when Seville was attacked. The Moors' name for these intruders was heathen wizards. The attack on Seville was beaten off, but in 859, 2 Viking pirates operating in the Loire joined forces in an ambitious plan to sack Rome. The longboats of Bjorn Ironside and Halstein combined to form an impressive fleet of 62 ships. Passing through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Vikings wintered in the Rhone Delta. The next summer, Pisans were stunned by Viking raiders descending on their town after a sea voyage of over 3,000 miles. The Vikings may have been in a class of their own as navigators, but in other respects their geography left something to be desired. It was Luna that received the wrath intended for Rome, and the Vikings were on their way home before they discovered the error. Principally, the Vikings that tormented Western Europe were from Denmark and Norway. Sweden had its own Vikings, but they had turned east. Using the epic lengths of the Volga and Dnieper rivers, the Vikings penetrated into the heart of Russia and beyond. In the first recorded Viking act in that part of the world, in 852, the people of Novgorod paid money to Swedish Vikings to leave them in peace. This form of blackmail money would have been depressingly familiar to the people of the West. In 858, the Vikings even had the audacity to launch a raid against Constantinople, by some distance the largest city in Europe. The Vikings themselves simply called it Miklagath, the Great Town. The expedition set off from Kiev, rowing the length of the Dnieper to reach the Black Sea, but Constantinople proved too tough a nut to crack. Raids against extremities of the Byzantine Empire proved more rewarding. Swedish Vikings particularly were talented merchants, and their eastern voyages brought them into contact with equally entrepreneurial characters from the Orient. In markets from the mouth of the Volga to Jerusalem, they traded for silks and spices from as far as India and China. Within a century, the Vikings, in the midst of a Slavic population, had faded from view as a distinct group. It was a process of assimilation that was to characterize Viking colonies across Europe. But they had made sufficient impression on the Byzantine emperor for him to form a personal guard from Viking mercenaries. This became one of history's most famous elite fighting units, the Varangian Guard.
it was exclusively composed of Scandinavian mercenary warriors, an elite bodyguard. They were the highest paid of all the emperor's troops.
It seems that the reason for the Byzantine Empire having these forces is because they were renowned for their fighting skills, and also, I suspect, because they were regarded as being perhaps more faithful and less involved in Byzantine politics, possibly. We know that even by about 945 there was a treaty set up which enabled, or whereby the Byzantine Emperor specifically requested to have these troops sent to him. So you can see that by perhaps 50 or 75 years after this empire first really took root, the Byzantines really respected the Scandinavian fighters.
But of all the lands to suffer at the hands of Viking raiders, it was the British Isles that were to endure the worst. As raids intensified in the course of the 9th century against islands that were politically divided and at war with themselves, conquest and colonization were added to the Viking agenda. In 839 in Ireland, Vikings had wintered near Lough Neagh. Under the legendary Viking leader Turgis, the Vikings went on to establish a base at Dublin 2 years later. Other settlements followed, at Waterford, Wexford, Wicklow, Cork and Limerick. Years later, Turgis himself was killed by the Irish, drowned in Lough Neagh. And as the native population fought back, Viking contingents from Norway and Sweden fought amongst themselves. The Vikings in Ireland would go on to successfully integrate themselves politically, economically and culturally, so that even after the Kingdom of Dublin's crushing defeat at Clontarf in 1014, their influence was still felt. In historic tradition, Anglo-Saxon England is described as a heptarchy, that is, a country of 7 kingdoms. Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia and Northumbria. This was always a simplification, and in the middle of the 9th century, very far from fact. Wessex was now the kingdom on the rise, after a period of Mercian dominance under King Offa. In 853, the chronicles record an Anglo-Saxon assault upon the Viking base on the Isle of Thanet.
The same year, also, Elcher with the men of Kent and Huda with the men of Surrey fought in the Isle of Thanet with the heathen army, and soon obtained the victory. But there were many men slain and drowned on either hand, and both the aldermen killed.
Pitched battles are very rare, and the Vikings try and avoid these wherever possible. Of course they do, and it's very difficult for an Anglo-Saxon king to come along and to create a situation where you can have a pitched battle against the Vikings. Because by the time they've arrived, they've got the loot, they go, you've called up your army, the Vikings have gone. When you do actually manage to corner them, they fight in a very similar way to the warrior aristocracies of Western Christendom. They wear the same sort of equipment, the Frankish sword, the Frankish javelin. There is the battle axe, but the Anglo-Saxon warriors use battle axe too. So they look the same, they dress the same, they fight with the shield war in very much the same way.
In 865, a traumatic chapter began in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. In East Anglia, the chronicles talk of the landing of a Danish host that came to be known as the Great Army. Estimates of the army's size vary massively. 3,000 men is amongst the more credible suggestions. Amongst this army's leadership were 4 sons of the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok.
Ragnar Lothbrok, or Ragnar Shaggy Breeches, is first mentioned in a 11th century account of the Dukes of Normandy, mentioned very briefly. The fullest information we've got for him is from a 13th century Icelandic saga, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and this is where the story of his death comes from.
He meets his death in a pit of snakes, captured by King Ella of Northumbria. Unfortunately for King Ella, he was to die very, very shortly afterwards at the hands of a couple of Vikings who were supposedly Ragnar's sons. Now, the saga makes out that this is an act of revenge, and it makes this definite genealogical link between Ragnar and his sons, but in the earlier sources this isn't really very clear at all.
It basically seems as though the story is an entire fabrication. We know that the sons of Ragnar, Ivar the Boneless, Björn and Sigurd, were historical figures, but the figure of Ragnar Lothbrok himself seems to be literary invention.
After camping in East Anglia, which the great army spared in return for the payment of gold, they travelled north into Northumbria. Northumbria, once itself the dominant kingdom in England, had been the first victim of the Vikings in 793. Now, racked by bitter internal feuds, she fought desperately for survival, but in vain. York was captured and the kingdom overrun. If the stories are to be believed, Iella, king of Northumbria, was killed. As revenge for the death of Ragnar Lodbrok, he was subjected to the horrific Blood Eagle death.
The rite of the Blood Eagle supposedly involves the Vikings killing their enemy by cutting away their ribs all the way down from the top all the way to the bottom, removing the ribs on both sides of the spine, and then removing their lungs, and then offering these lungs as a sacrifice to the god Odin. Again, whether this is myth or whether this is indeed reality is very unclear, because our best source for this, rather like the myth of Ragnar Lothbrok, comes from a much later saga, Orkney Inga saga, which was written down 200, 300, possibly 400 years after the events it supposedly depicts.
After the conquest of Northumbria, the Danish army turned its attentions towards Mercia. But Wessex and Mercia had joined forces to face this new threat. And after heavy fighting around Nottingham, and probably the payment of gold, the Vikings returned to York. In 870, the Great Army returned to East Anglia. This time, King Edmund met them in battle at Hawkson. For Edmund, it was a disaster, with only the consolation that his awful death at the hands of pagans would lead to sainthood. The following year, the Viking army advanced into Wessex as far as Reading. In the depths of winter, the King of Wessex led an army to challenge them, and was victorious in the grueling Battle of Ashdown. But shortly afterwards, the king was dead, and the leadership of Wessex fell to his younger brother, Alfred. Fighting a reinforced Viking army at Wilton, Alfred was defeated. But with gold, the Vikings were persuaded to withdraw to winter quarters in London. The Danes spent the next few years roaming the length and breadth of the country at will, consolidating their conquests, suppressing Anglo-Saxon revolts, and exacting tribute from the surviving kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex. Vikings settled in the conquered kingdom of Northumbria, and after the expulsion of King Burgrod of Mercia, his helpless successors watched Vikings claim and settle the eastern part of the kingdom. Wessex alone avoided these ignominious fates. But in 878, a Viking army descended suddenly from Gloucester in the midst of winter, catching King Alfred completely unawares. Those of his forces that Alfred could muster in time for battle at Chippenham were scattered or destroyed by the Viking army of Guthrum. Alfred himself became a fugitive, withdrawing into the Somerset marshes. In a remarkable epic of survival and perseverance, Alfred raised fresh forces to confront the Vikings at Edington and won a decisive victory. Alfred became the first Anglo-Saxon king to dictate peace terms to the heathen invaders. The subsequent treaty established what has come to be known as the Danelaw, a swathe of England on the far side of Watling Street, of which Viking conquest was recognised. As part of the settlement, Guthrum himself was baptised a Christian.
Well, the relationship of the Vikings to Christianity is not straightforward. You can't talk about the Vikings as one homogeneous group. As individuals, they had different responses to Christianity. I think what's striking about the Vikings is their willingness to take on Christianity when they move into a new area. It's very clear, for example, that in Anglo-Saxon England, the Vikings are taking. Okay, they don't like monasticism, and they don't really take to monasticism. But Christianity, in general, seems to thrive under the Vikings in the 10th century in East Anglia, for example.
The reasons for conversion often seem to have been political. Guthrum, we know, converted to Christianity as part of a peace treaty that he signed with Alfred the Great, and his followers were converted as part of this peace treaty too. Harold Bluetooth, King of Denmark, probably converted because he was threatened by his German neighbours who were going to launch a crusade against their pagan northern neighbour if they weren't converted. So therefore there were often very good political reasons to convert to Christianity.
The establishment of the Danelaw did little to bring peace. Fresh Viking incursions and raids kept Alfred at war for the rest of his reign. But amongst Alfred's many remarkable achievements were military reforms that would be the basis of Anglo-Saxon reconquest. They included the creation of a fleet, the reorganisation of the peasant levy to provide a permanent army, and the establishment of fortified towns called burhs. These all helped Alfred the Great's successors to reconquer England over several decades. The last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was killed at Stainmore in 954. By the reign of Edgar 5 years later, the kings of Wessex were effectively kings of a united England.
During the settlement of the Danelaw in the 9th century, various different armies had settled and divided up the land, and it seems that after they'd settled there was a good deal of fragmentation, if you like. They didn't keep up their links, they intermarried with locals and so on. On top of that, in the 10th century, you've got another Viking conquest launched from Dublin, who imposed their kingship on the inhabitants of Yorkshire. And we know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that the Danes and the Norwegians didn't get on. There was conflict between them. So therefore, when it came to reconquering the Danelaw, the English kings faced a divided enemy, and they were able to exploit that.
If you look at the charter evidence, the reality is that what's happening is that there's some sense in which these West Saxon kings are buying into this new territory. We have other evidence which shows Viking jarls being involved in West Saxon armies. Viking jarls are there in the army that goes north with Athelstan to York in the 930s. So what do we mean by reconquest of the Danelaw? What is actually happening is we have an expansion of the West Saxon kingdom, which is very often to the advantage of those jarls who come under its control.
In France, native princes also mounted effective counterattacks, helped by the growing role of heavily armoured feudal cavalry. But the Vikings were far from a spent force. When they returned with a vengeance, in the unhappy reign of King Ethelred. Shortly after his reign began in 979, Ethelred faced a new kind of threat from Scandinavia, Sven Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. He was supported by the raids of several Viking chieftains, operating more or less independently of the Danish king. One such chieftain was Olaf Tryggvason. The situation reached crisis point when disaster overtook the English at the Battle of Maldon.
The Battle of Maldon took place in 991. This is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and one or two other brief references to it. But our main source is a much later poem which seems to record a story which was possibly recorded orally, possibly comes from other written sources, and was written down much later. Many of the names in the poem probably didn't mean very much to people even a few decades or a generation or two after the poem was written, because it's almost like a commemorative poem, recording the names of particular people and what they did at this battle. Some of them are portrayed as being loyal and supporting their leader, and some of them are portrayed as being cowards.
The epic poem of the battle doubtless gives a romanticised picture of courageous but doomed English resistance, but some interesting historical details do emerge. After attacks on Folkestone, Sandwich and Ipswich in 991, the Viking fleet of Olaf Tryggvason had encamped on Northey Island, east of Maldon. There they were confronted by an English army commanded by the Ealdorman of Essex, Byrhtnoth. Northey Island was, and still is, an island just so long as the tide is high. When the tide recedes, a causeway to the island is revealed. The first clash was verbal. Byrhtnoth sneered at the Viking threats shouted across the water and their offer to leave peacefully in exchange for gold. A desultory exchange of arrow fire began, but no real harm could be done whilst the tide was high. When it receded, the Vikings poured down the causeway. But in unconscious imitation of Horatius defending Rome, 3 English champions held the land bridge against all comers. It appeared that the two armies would be spared a pitched battle. Then, in a move which at first appears incredible, Byrhtnoth accepted the Viking request to cross the causeway unmolested.
The poem tells us it was offermod, overconfidence. In many ways, the Battle of Maldon, the poem of the Battle of Maldon, is a classic tragedy. What we have is somebody who has a characteristic which in most circumstances is something to be applauded. Overconfidence is something that's to be applauded in an Anglo-Saxon ealdorman. He's got to look the part, he's got to be the part, and that means being what we might describe as being arrogant. And that overconfidence, that offermod, is good. But in this particular instance, it brings about his downfall, and that's the tragedy according to the poet.
Under the furious onslaught of the Scandinavians, the English army began to buckle. Byrhtnoth himself went down in a maelstrom of sword cuts and spear thrusts. As the Ealdorman's army disintegrated, a handful of thanes rallied to fight on. They threw themselves against the invaders with suicidal courage, and all were killed. In the wake of this English disaster, Ethelred was forced to buy peace from the Vikings. To save London that year, £10,000 of silver was handed over.
In the short term, paying the Vikings off was probably a good thing, because it meant that they would probably try their hand somewhere else. They surely would see that you didn't have the ability to gain vast sums of cash again in the short term, because the whole process of collecting this tribute must have taken some time. In the longer term, however, very clearly it signalled to the Vikings that you were prepared to give in, you were prepared to concede, and that if they hassled you again and again and again, that you would again give in, because this was a better thing for you to do than to fight them.
I think one of the things that's in Danegeld for the Anglo-Saxon and Frankish monarchs is that it allows you to tax your own populace, which is rather nice, because of course in early medieval Europe the man who taxes you is the man who's levying tribute on you. In other words, he's your enemy. Good lords are supposed to be laffords, loaf givers. They're supposed to give rings, they're supposed to give wealth. They're not supposed to tax you. Well, this enables you to tax your population, which is rather nice. And I think if you look at Anglo-Saxon monarchs, what they are doing is they are creaming off money from paying Danegeld. Okay, you have to levy the Danegeld on your population, but then part of that you have yourself and the rest you pay to the Danes.
King Ethelred was in an almost hopeless position. Not only was the external threat enormous, but his own thanes were capable of treachery to match the Vikings' own infighting. His impotence and the invaders' continually broken promises of good behaviour caused the king to lash out in 1002. On the eve of St. Brice's Day, Ethelred ordered that all Danes within his kingdom should be killed. The string of murders that followed, known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, turned out to be one of Ethelred's biggest blunders. We shall never know how many Danes were killed, certainly nothing close to all within the kingdom, but Gunhild, wife of Palle, was amongst the dead. Her brother was enraged and determined to have his revenge upon the English. Her brother was the King of Denmark, Sven Forkbeard. The Danish attacks on England intensified the following year. In 1014, 20 years of battery culminated in the conquest of England by Sven's army. Ethelred fled to Normandy, and Sven was briefly recognised as King of England before he died of natural causes. Despite a brief revival in English fortunes under the leadership of Edmund Ironside, Sven's son, Knut, would go on to rule a fleeting empire that encompassed England, Denmark and Norway. Knut's marriage to Emma, the widow of Ethelred, paved the way for the return of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty in 1042. Edward the Confessor, who succeeded to the English throne in that year, was Ethelred's son and the stepson of Knut. The contested succession that followed his death in 1066 would be the Vikings' swan song. It was from France that the successful challenge would come, in the shape of William the Conqueror. William himself was the descendant of Danish Vikings, but it is Harald Hardrada who's often given the epithet of the last Viking. His title, Hardrada, meant hard ruler, and this fierce king of Norway in every way lived up to the classic image of the Viking.
Harald Hardrada was, in a sense, quite a minor figure in Norway as a politician. He was the half-brother of St. Olaf. In 1015 he supposedly left Norway after defeat in battle in which his half-brother had been killed. From there he goes south, he serves in armies in Eastern Europe, and then eventually he winds up in Byzantium and serves in the Varangian Guard.
Around 1045, so when he was about 30 years old, he headed back to Norway, where he dislodged his nephew Magnus from the Norwegian throne and ruled in Norway for 20 years. But I suppose the single most famous episode in his life was the Battle of Stamford Bridge.
In 1066, Hardrada left Norway to enforce his own spurious claim to the English throne. After winning a victory at Fulford against local forces, Hardrada was surprised by Harold Godwin's army racing up from the south. In the slaughter that followed at Stamford Bridge, it was the King of England's housecarls that would be decisive in the annihilation of the Viking army. professional soldiers introduced as the king's household troops by King Knut, they now fought to defend England from Norwegian Vikings. The King of Norway fell with most of his army, and the corpse-strewn wreckage of the battlefield marked the defeat of the last real Viking threat.
There are a couple of key things that have happened in Western Christendom by 1100 to make the Vikings less of a problem. The first is perhaps the most important, in that the Vikings have been brought within the fold. By 1100 they've been Christianized. By 1100 there are bishops in Scandinavia who are receiving letters from the popes who are part and parcel of Western Christendom. They are within rather than without.
On the one hand, the people who were defending themselves got better. Clearly fortifications were increased and improved across Western Europe over the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, and we start to see stone castles being built. And in some sense this may be related to the kind of raiding on the scale that we see with the Vikings. On the other hand, the Vikings actually get what they want. People from Scandinavia actually become kings of England, for example. They become rulers of Normandy. So the people with the most wealth and the most power have actually been successful by this stage.
The image of the Viking has traditionally been that of the bloodthirsty pagan, looting, raping and murdering almost for his own amusement. Clearly, the Vikings were men capable of tremendous acts of violence. But the Viking era was not the Holocaust that has sometimes been represented. And their most enduring legacies were to result from their accomplishments as seafarers, merchants and artists. In the 13th century, a new and devastating plague struck at the heart of Central Asia, rippling outwards to envelop the lands from China to Poland. This was a plague of unbridled terror, not of rats and disease, but of men. The Mongolian tribes exploded out of the Central Asian steppes with a ferocity never seen before, on a campaign of bloodthirsty conquest that would last for the next 100 years. The Mongolian battlefield tactics and their remarkable courage and resilience have become the stuff of legend. They were simply natural warriors. But it took one leader to unite and lead them on the path to power. That leader was Genghis Khan.
I think Genghis Khan's legacy today is his reputation as a great conqueror and ruthless ruler. Under him, the Mongols were able to sweep out of Central Asia and take over most of the known world.
I'd say that when Genghis Khan was alive, he would claim that he had conquered the world and conquered the people who talked 720 languages. And he conquered the states of 5 different colours, so that he proclaimed Mongolia's independence throughout the world.
One of the common myths about Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, is that he was a sort of barbaric strongman who managed to somehow unite fierce and free nomadic tribes into this horde that then rampaged across Europe. But the reality is something, I think, much more interesting. So I think we could compare him to someone more like William the Conqueror. He's a nobleman, effectively. He's an aristocrat. And at that time, steppe society was divided between aristocrats and commoners, and high office was only held by aristocrats.
Genghis Khan was born about the year 1167 with the original name of Temujin. His father was a local chieftain and nephew of the former Khan, or ruler, of the Mongol tribe. At the tender age of 9, his family escaped to safety after a rival tribe murdered his father, and it was while he was in exile that Temujin met Borte, his bride-to-be. The young man was given a black sable coat to use as a dowry. He used the coat to buy influence and favor with tribal elders and with the leader of the Karaite, a tribe in central Mongolia. The tribal leader took Temujin under his wing, but the new alliance was tested when the Merkit, a rival tribe from the north, raided the Karaite camp and kidnapped Borte. Mustering all the support he could, Temujin and his new tribal allies met and defeated the Merkit in battle and rescued Borte. By now, Temujin was growing in status and power, making alliances with other tribes and calling in the favors once owed to his father. In 1202, he surrounded and crushed the Tatars near the river Kalka in eastern Mongolia. In an early example of his distinctive style of military rule, he forbade his troops to loot until the Tatars had been completely crushed. He even went as far as to confiscate the spoils of those who disobeyed him. With this significant victory under his belt, and helped by the constant warring between other tribes, Temujin became the dominant figure in the region. Soon, other Mongol leaders had pledged their allegiance to him and had proclaimed him universal ruler, Genghis Khan. History has forever known him as Genghis Khan.
I think that Genghis Khan's success really depends upon his ability to produce plunder, conquests for his supporters, and the wider his territories grew, the more he was able to recruit subject nations who also benefited from Mongol expansion.
Although we might think of the steppes as marginal, faraway, distant places, and it's very easy to think of them as remote and desolate, actually these are centres of power. They might look geographically very dispersed, you might have difficulty seeing settlements and so on, but taken together, if you gathered together the horses and the people from these steppe lands, you had the most enormously powerful capabilities militarily.
In the year 1206, with most of the Mongol tribes united under one ruler for the first time in their history, Genghis Khan was declared king, or Khan, of Mongolia. His reputation alone earned him many followers, who, weary of constant tribal conflict, flocked to his banner to share the comradeship and the unrivaled spoils of his military campaigns. The charismatic new king was physically very different to most of his Mongol subjects. He was comparatively tall and powerfully built, with piercing grey-green eyes. Sure as he could be of his domestic position, Genghis was able to set his sights on foreign conquests, and he first cast his eyes towards neighbouring China. Conquest may have seemed impossible, even suicidal to attempt, but in the early 13th century, China was stricken with internal divisions. The nation was carved up into 3 fragments: the Qin Empire in the north, the Xia in the northwest, and the Sung state in the south. A lot hinged on the success of the Chinese campaign. It would be the Mongols' first test against a land of settlers. They could not be certain that their nomad battle tactics would work.
Genghis was well prepared before he set off to fight the Qin state. Firstly, to test the Mongol army, his commanders fought and took the Tamgud and Urgud states without him taking the field. This meant that Genghis was able to assess his army's strengths and weaknesses. He also used the Tamgud and Urgud campaigns to practice and refine his methods for attacking and destroying fortified places and using their resources to build and test his siege engines. So Genghis was well prepared to face the Qin Empire.
After subduing the weakest of the three empires, the Shia, in a brief campaign during 1209, Genghis Khan turned on the Qin state in 1211. Armed with 180,000 men, the Mongol force plundered and looted to within 25 miles of Beijing. However, the Mongol advance was slowed by one weakness that would haunt them for years to come: the inability to besiege fortified cities. An aspect of war that was new to the Mongols, Genghis Khan and his men struggled at first to adapt their battlefield tactics to the requirements of siege warfare. But Genghis Khan was unafraid of new ideas. So, with the aid of Chinese prisoners and their knowledge of engineering, he had siege machines built and troops specially trained for besieging cities. The new tactics worked handsomely as the cities of Hebei, Shandong and Shanxi all fell.
Genghis improved the engineering part of his army by utilising the skills of the artisans and craftsmen of the lands he conquered. Members of the Mongol force would search for any advantages in armaments that the defeated enemy possessed. And instead of shutting it down, would develop the technology and channel it back into their own force. By doing this, the more people the Mongols conquered, the greater the improvements in their army's capabilities.
In 1214, the exhausted Chinese emperor finally surrendered, giving his daughter to Genghis Khan, along with 1,000 child slaves, 3,000 horses, and vast amounts of gold, silver, and silk. Beijing threw its gates open to the Mongols, who showed no mercy as they savagely ransacked the city. With the capital safely conquered, Genghis Khan felt confident enough to leave one of his generals to oversee the rest of the China campaign. So in the spring of 1216, he decided to focus his attention on Central Asia. By this time, the most western reaches of the Mongol territory shared borders with the Islamic state of Khwarezm, a vast but disorganized empire covering modern-day Iran. Its leader, Shah Muhammad, had foolishly executed a caravan of Mongol traders at Utrar, and had then made matters worse by having the envoy sent to his court to demand an explanation put to death. With these ruthless murders, the Shah had signed his own death warrant and signalled the end of his empire. The response of Genghis Khan was chillingly curt.
You have chosen war. That will happen which will happen, and what it is to be we know not.
The success of the Mongol military machine lay in its disciplined, skilled and well-equipped army. At the heart of the Mongol army was the horse, which was not only crucial to the army, but central to the Mongol way of life. Mongol children were taught to ride horses from a very early age, and horse thieves were summarily executed. With saddles and stirrups, Mongol riders had all the stability they needed when shooting arrows on horseback at high speed. As a result, it was possible to inflict heavy, sometimes crippling losses on an enemy during the skirmish phase of battle, long before the main armies actually clashed in combat.
Cavalry was the most powerful and useful military device. A herd of horses, if you like, was a supercarrier at that time. Thousands of horses meant the ability to move and strike much more quickly than the agricultural and urban defenders could catch up with you. One of the key Mongol techniques was to use not just one or two horses, but whole strings of remounts. So a single soldier would often lead several horses, and this allowed them to change horses when the first horse was tired and to keep moving. This allowed unparalleled mobility. They were able to cover the sorts of distances that in medieval times armies couldn't usually hope to cover these sorts of distances. Advances 50, 60, 70 miles a day were recorded for whole Mongol armies, and these are enormously quick, especially when they're kept up over many days, so that in some cases Mongols could move ahead of the news of their arrival. They'd appear unexpectedly in front of a town or city before the messengers had even had a chance to arrive from their previous conquest.
Each Mongol cavalryman was equipped with a horn and sinew bow that gave an impressive firing range of around 300 meters. 2 types of arrows were kept in separate quivers: 30 light arrows for firing at a distance and 30 heavily tipped arrows for use at close range. Some arrows even had incendiary heads.
Nomadic life was a perfect training for warfare. Everyone was a consummate horseman and also knew how to use a strong bow. This meant that they were very mobile and could put down literally a barrage of arrows on an enemy. In addition, the Great Khan sponsored something called the Great Hunt, in which everybody was encouraged to go out and round up a huge quantity of game. This encircling manoeuvre could then be translated into military strategy and used to defeat enemies.
Genghis's army had a 10 system, so he had divisions of 10,000, 1,000, 100 and platoons of 10. This system meant that his army was easy to control and formations were organised effectively. Also, one division had the job of scouting ahead and collecting information on the geography of the area they were to attack. Where would be the best place to attack the enemy force, how many men made up the force, and what were its strengths and weaknesses. The Mongolian army was very disciplined, and if one soldier disobeyed an order, then the whole 10 or platoon was punished. That's why Genghis's soldiers tried not to make any mistakes, as they did not want their fellow soldiers punished because of them. This is why discipline was a strong characteristic of Genghis's force.
Mongol warriors were issued with small swords, a wickerwork shield, 2 or 3 javelins, and a dagger strapped to the inside of the left forearm. Each soldier wore a raw silk undershirt, which acted as a protective vest. If a warrior was struck by an arrow, the silk would wrap itself around the arrowhead, reducing the impact and enabling it to be removed easily and painlessly. Each man was also issued with a waterproof hide saddlebag, which could be inflated for river crossings. The bag contained enough supplies and rations to enable a Mongol warrior to exist completely independently of the main army.
What the Mongols also possessed was the psychological weapons of terror. They were utterly ruthless, they devastated territory, and this meant that people who faced them in war were already half-beaten, you might say, before they encountered them.
We could also compare it, if you like, to modern strategies. After all, at the time, that was an accepted sort of approach to strategy and to politics, much as mutually assured deterrence was so important in the Cold War. We've got a situation where over the heads of the various nations was held the destruction of whole cities in both cases. So deterrence also provided a key plank in Genghis Khan's strategy to convince the subject, his conquered subjects, that if they did revolt, they would not be spared.
Not only was the individual Mongol warrior well prepared and equipped for battle, the army of which he was a part was also a highly organized fighting machine. But it would not be long before this effective fighting force would meet its first challenge on the banks of the Indus River.
Although the Khwarazm Shah ruled a great empire, it should not be forgotten that this was a recent creation of fairly uncertain loyalty. And this explains perhaps why Shah Muhammad didn't really want to engage the Mongols in battle in 1219.
Another problem was that he had very extended front along hundreds of miles on his eastern border. He had to spread out his defensive army formations because he really had very poor intelligence when it came to what Genghis Khan's intentions or routes were.
Genghis Khan left Mongolia in the spring of 1219 with an army of 150,000 men. Meanwhile, his enemy, Shah Muhammad, deployed 300,000 well-equipped troops along a 500-mile stretch of what is now the Jaxartes River. But still, the Khwarezmian border was dangerously vulnerable. From 1219 to 1220, in a sustained, highly coordinated three-pronged attack, the Mongols systematically destroyed the Shah's empire.
Genghis Khan and his master tactician, Subadai, had devised an extraordinary plan to conquer the Khwarezmian Empire. They divided into separate columns. These were separate independent armies that were able to move over hundreds of miles to attack the Khwarezm Shah's empire from different directions. One column was led by Chinggis and Subadai himself. Another was led by his eldest son, Jochi, and Jochi's job was to move up and down the eastern border of the Khwarezm Shah's realm, creating a defensive screen, if you like, raiding towns, taking cities. And this generated a real sensation of panic on one side, pressure on one side of the Khwarezm Shah's realm. But at the same time, he was being outflanked through the Kizilkum Desert itself, which was thought to be impossibly inhospitable and quite impassable. Genghis Khan and Subadai found a route to emerge at the gates of Bukhara, where the Khwarezm Shah was, quite unexpectedly.
After 2 days, the Mongols made their move. 50,000 Tajik infantry poured out of the city to meet the Mongols, but resistance was futile. 5 days later, the king's uncle defected, along with tens of thousands of mercenaries, joining the seething Mongol horde to batter down the city gates. The Shah managed to escape his Mongol pursuers only in the spring of 1221 to die a broken and defeated man on a remote island in the Caspian Sea. In the summer of 1221, Genghis scaled the Hindu Kush to search for the Khwarezmian king's son, Shah Jalal ad-Din, who, it was rumoured, was trying to raise troops near Ghazni in Afghanistan. Genghis Khan sent 40,000 men ahead to gather intelligence. North of Kabul at Parwan, the Mongol reconnaissance troops had been beaten by a force twice the strength of their own. But by the time Genghis Khan had reached Ghazni, defections had caused the Khwarezmian army to shrink to half its former size. In an attempt to regroup, Jalal ad-Din had fled to the Indus Valley, but this time the Mongol forces were in hot pursuit. They caught up with Jalal ad-Din and his soldiers at night as they made preparations to ford the river Indus the following day. At daybreak, 50,000 Mongol warriors faced 50,000 Khwarezmian troops. Then, the Shah ordered Emir Malik on his right wing to charge the Mongol left, driving it back. Seeing that the Mongols' right flank did not seem to pose a threat, Jalal ad-Din weakened his left flank to reinforce Malik's success on the right. The Shah then prepared to land what he believed would be the fatal blow for the Mongol army. Leading from the front, Jalal ad-Din headed an enormous charge aimed at breaking the Mongol centre. Now the Shah had the chance to avenge his father's death. He directed his troops straight at Genghis Khan himself. For the first time, the hitherto unthinkable prospect of defeat for the great leader and his army was very real indeed.
In the great battle with the Khwarezm Shah, Genghis Khan actually adopted quite a cautious strategy and allowed Jalal ad-Din to launch an attack on him. Of course, this was a deception, and So it meant that the Islamic army was really sucked into the centre of the Mongol army, allowing an outflanking manoeuvre which really had not been anticipated.
As Muhammad and his men thundered into the Mongol centre, Genghis Khan, leaving his hard-pressed centre to defend themselves, led his imperial guard in a charge so fierce that it completely shattered the force of Emir Malik, who had previously been so successful on the Mongolian left flank. Then came the tactical masterstroke. Unknown to Jalal ad-Din, Genghis Khan had also ordered a division detached from his right wing to scale the mountains, encircling the Khwarezmian left flank. It was this force that fell upon the Shah's men, who were unprepared for the sudden, savage assault. Soon, the Mongols had blocked the king's retreat to the south.
The role of the respective leaders in battle is a little bit difficult to identify from the sources that we have today, but I think we must see Genghis Khan as having the kind of energy and ability to direct his forces which the Muslim commander seems to have lacked. In essence, though, when Jalal ad-Din committed himself to a headlong charge, he lost command of his ability to run the battle, you might say. It's important to remember that in this period, communication is essentially personal. It's tempting to view Genghis Khan as a man who could sort of move the pieces on the chessboard at will. And perhaps if anybody could command battlefield troops in this area, he did as well as any. But in actual fact, it was more like a clockwork toy that you wound up and then set on its way, hoping that people would carry out their instructions to the letter.
Jalal ad-Din himself had escaped the carnage, but his army had been torn apart. Doubtless concluding that discretion was the better part of valour, he flung off his armour, mounted a horse, and with 700 lucky survivors, forded the Indus River to escape to freedom. In his desperation to flee from the Mongolian army, Shah Muhammad had been forced to leave behind his young family, and the unfortunate infants were shown no pity. They were unceremoniously flung into the swirling waters of the Indus River. The eldest was just 8 years old. It was in the year 1227 that Genghis Khan finally breathed his last. He was 65 years old, and he left behind an empire that stretched from the East China coast to the Caspian Sea. The first Mongol incursions had already been made into Russia, and the states of modern Pakistan and northern India conquered and ransacked.
The driving force behind Mongol expansion in the 13th century has to be the standard nomadic desire for plunder, for slaves, for domination, managed by a leader who can deliver that, who can organise the balance of power between conflicting tribes, between ambitious warlords and so on. And so Genghis Khan has to play a big role in ensuring Mongol success, but if you like, he uses the natural forces of his type of communities, the nomadic tribes, in order to achieve empire.
But he was also able to do something else. He was able to organise the resources of the regions he conquered to generate springboards for further conquests. So this is, if you like, not just a victory of wild barbarians from the steppes over civilized. Nothing of that case at all. Instead, it's a victory, if you like, of long traditions of statehood, of careful diplomatic leadership, and of a real coming of age of steppe leadership, where Genghis Khan was able to make use of the conquered nations as well to increase the size and extent of his empire.
With Genghis Khan gone, it was 8 years before the great Mongolian war council, called the Kurultai, assembled to determine the next stage of Mongolian expansion. They decided to turn their attention to Russia and Europe.
It's true to say that by the 1230s, Western Europe was pretty well uninformed about the danger of the Mongol threat. The Russian principalities had a much keener awareness of the presence of Mongol military power, because they had been defeated in the Battle of the Kalka River, which lies just to the north of the Sea of Azov, in 1223. But then the Mongols left because Genghis called back his commander, Subutai, perhaps suspecting him of getting too big for his boots, and it may be that the Russians thought the nomadic threat had gone away, as it had done frequently in the past. And certainly they did not unify and present a determined front when the Mongols returned 20 years later.
Politically and strategically, the Mongols could not have timed their campaign any better. The struggle between the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and the Pope was nearing its climax, weakening any hope of assembling a united European force to repel the Eastern invaders. What was more, the last attempt by Europe's monarchs to form a united front against an alien enemy, the Fifth Crusade, had collapsed in disarray some years earlier.
This was a time when Europe was bitterly divided. All the monarchs of the region ruled sets of nobles who were more or less independent from them. So there was real problems with Europe getting its act together in the face of a Mongol threat.
There was a basic division along religious grounds between the Latin West and the Orthodox East. The Crusaders had actually conquered Constantinople in 1204, and in so doing destroyed the balance of power which had been maintained by the Byzantine state for 8 centuries. This meant that the nomadic dwellers of the steppe and the Islamic East with its great city-states were played off against one another. This was something that the Westerners simply couldn't manage. Crusades were useful military tools, but they were often had specific objectives, and also they were quite temporary agglomerations of troops. So they didn't necessarily help in the long term.
Thanks to raids made in the early 13th century, the Mongols probably knew as much about their prospective enemies as technical limitations of the age would allow. This intelligence was used to good effect on the campaign trail, with light cavalry leading the way up to 100 miles ahead of the main force, thereby decreasing the possibility of any unwelcome surprises. The Europeans, on the other hand, were in blissful ignorance of the terror lying in store for them. Rumours had reached them about a new military force destroying parts of the Islamic world, and these were welcomed as confirmation of the legend of Prester John, who would one day come to the assistance of the besieged Christian nations battling the Islamic powers in Spain and the Middle East. Others thought that they were probably pagans, but held the tantalizing idea that the Mongols might be converted to Christianity and brought into a giant coalition to crush the Muslim world.
The legend of Prester John was that somewhere far to the east, on the other side of the Islamic nations by which the West felt so threatened, there was a great Christian king. When the Mongols appeared and were attacking and destroying Islamic states, people in the West thought, at last, that the Christian king has come to save us. But of course it was a complete fantasy. And when the Mongols themselves arrived, they proved to be worse than the Islamic nations.
Marco Polo states that the material, the reality behind the myth, was actually a man called Wang Khan. Now, there was a Christian ruler of a steppe polity, Torul Khan of the Keret. And Torul himself was a Nestorian Christian, and Nestorians were a sect of Eastern Christians who had split very early on when the Patriarch of Constantinople had to leave as a result of religious disputes in Constantinople and fled into the east. When the armies marched from the east, the Mongols included a number of different Keret nobles. Some of these were Nestorian Christians. So the strange reality, the weird reality, is that the reality behind these myths ended up as being the fearsome Mongol conquerors from the steppes of Asia.
After spending the summer of 1236 subduing the Bulgars and the Kipchaks, the Mongols decided to mount a military campaign that hundreds of years later would be beyond the armies of Napoleon and Hitler. Once the ravages of winter had taken hold, the Mongols invaded Russia.
The Mongols were different sorts of invaders. They were very well adapted at moving around in winter. They came from the freezing steppes of Mongolia, even colder than the Russian steppes. And the frozen rivers actually formed highways through the otherwise very difficult terrain of woods and hills, poor roads. So what appears to be a barrier, a river, can turn into a highway. And the Mongols used this. Their ponies were not shod, they could keep their grip on the slippery ice, and they used these channels to move through Russia to surprise their Russian opponents, to emerge outside towns and cities, often before the news had got to those cities that the Mongol invasion was underway.
The Mongols had a supremely efficient intelligence system which enabled them to infiltrate the countries and the courts of potential victim states, if you like, and to choose the moment to attack. The Russian principalities did not help themselves because they allowed their nomadic allies, the Poloptians, to execute Mongol ambassadors, and this really was an important stimulus to the Mongols turning their beady eyes upon Russia.
13th century Russia was in disarray, with most of its population living in about a dozen principalities, sharing little but a common religion. After crossing the river Volga with a force of 120,000 men, Genghis Khan's grandson Batu and Subadai, a veteran commander of the Khwarezmian campaign, carved through central Russia with the aim of driving a wedge between the principalities of Novgorod and Kiev. The cities of Ryazan, Moscow, Kolomna, Suzdal and Vladimir all received demands for surrender from the rampant Mongolian invaders. Each and every city refused to surrender, believing no doubt that, like other nomadic invaders before them, the Mongolians would not be able to break down the city walls. The Mongolian army thought otherwise, and swiftly set about battering their way in with their siege machines. Every city was sacked, plundered and burned, and its inhabitants put to the sword.
The Mongols are famous, if you like, for the great terror that they inspired in their enemies. And there's no getting away from the fact that this was an element, a part of their strategy. Genghis Khan was famous for being very resolute when it came to enforcing what he thought of as the honourable surrender of cities. If a city surrendered straight away, it was almost always left unharmed. Plundering might take place, but it was generally controlled and well ordered, and often there wasn't any substantial plundering. If cities resisted, they risked being annihilated. And worst of all was if a city surrendered and then revolted. In this case, the Mongol forces made a point of annihilating the population, including women and children. So there's no doubt that this was important. And of course, if a Mongol envoy appears at a city demanding surrender, people were bound to take it pretty seriously when they'd heard about the fates of other cities. But I think we have to get this in perspective. It seems barbaric, of course it was, but it was also not unknown at the time as a fairly standard tactic.
4 months into the campaign, the Mongols discovered one of Russia's most formidable natural defences, as in the spring thaw of 1237, the ground transformed itself into a bottomless quagmire of mud. The appalling conditions underfoot forced them to abandon their main objective in northern Russia, and so Novgorod was spared. Batu and Subadai took the opportunity to rest their weary troops, and it was not until the summer of 1240 that they resumed the Russian campaign. The power of the rejuvenated Mongol army was undiminished, and the area around Kiev was devastated in the same way as much of central Russia had been in early 1238. In early December of that year, Kiev itself was stormed, and although it was by far the largest and richest of all Russian cities, it succumbed after only 2 days of savage fighting and was razed to the ground. Only the Cathedral of St. Sophia, a symbol of the faith shared by all Russians, was spared.
The Mongols were very tolerant of different religions. Their own background was pagan, if you like, eclectic. They were quite happy to mix one religion with another. The Mongol imperial capital of Karakorum, for example, eventually had chapels, churches, mosques, Buddhist temples, all in the same location. So this became, if you like, one of the diplomatic cards which Genghis Khan was able to play. It was well known, and he made sure that it was well known in the surrounding regions, that the Khan was tolerant of all sorts of religion.
Genghis could conquer people with the sword, but couldn't conquer their minds. So he decided to play with religion. In Karakoro, he gave representatives of many different faiths the freedom to practice their religions. By doing this, he thought the people of the lands he controlled would be less hostile to the Mongols and enable his rule to continue for many years to come.
With Kiev in ruins and the rest of western Ukraine in tatters, Batu consolidated his forces in southeastern Poland, and it was here that Subutai revealed his plans for his most daring campaign yet, an invasion of Hungary with 100,000 men by way of the Carpathian Mountains. Unstable Hungary offered excellent grazing land for the horses of the Mongolian cavalry. The same fertile land had been used by Attila the Hun some 800 years earlier. In any case, Hungary would have to be crushed if the Mongolian drive westward was to continue. Subadai's strategic plan to invade Hungary was daring and vast. The campaign called for a force of about 20,000 to invade Poland, acting as the army's northern flank. Subadai would lead a long-range group through the Romanian plains and up the Danube Valley to attack Hungary from the south. Bela IV, the young Hungarian king, gathered an army at Buda, later to become Budapest, to face the Mongolian invasion. He may even have been confident of success. After all, the Hungarian army was well prepared and trained, and anyway, the Mongolians would first have to cross the treacherous Carpathian Mountains. Any hope that the mountains would slow the Mongolian advance was ended on the 14th of March, 1241, when Bela received the unwelcome news that the Mongols had not only scaled the Carpathian Mountains, they were advancing towards Buda at a rate of 50 miles a day. Bela's position was even worse than he imagined, for unbeknown to him, a second Mongol force under Batu was heading towards him from the west. By the end of March, the Mongol armies had reunited outside Pest. In panic, King Bela sent his wife to Vienna. His barons, an unruly and disloyal collection, were not slow to spot an opportunity and made a series of demands to the king before they would pledge to fight. Eventually, the stage seemed set for a bloody and momentous battle. It was then that the Mongol army seemed to vanish into thin air.
In the context of the Hungarian campaign of 1241, the Mongols' feigned retreat really was a classic tactic. They were capable of doing this at a tactical level, their horse archers riding forward and then seemingly running away and drawing people into a trap or an ambush. But they also did it at a strategic level by advancing into Hungary and then retiring to some well-watered grazing lands and waiting for the Hungarian king to come and attack them.
On the 10th of April, the Mongols retreated to Mohi, near the Carpathian Mountains. With plentiful grazing alongside the river Sajo, abundant marshes, and a forest canopy, the Mongol army simply set up camp and waited. They had found a battlefield that suited them perfectly. The trap had been set, and it was completed when Subadai led 30,000 men around and behind the Hungarian army, leaving it completely surrounded. Sadly for Bela, he remained in complete ignorance of the Mongolian movements.
King Bela of Hungary had very poor intelligence of Mongol movements. In part this was his fault, because his Cuman allies, who were nomads themselves, were quite capable of rapid movement and discovering what the Mongol intentions were, but they simply weren't trusted by the Western Hungarian nobility, and in fact had been expelled as fifth columnists, if you like. So King Bela simply had very poor intelligence because he didn't use the tools at hand to improve his options.
On the 11th of April, 1241, Batu's men, although vastly outnumbered by the Hungarian army, began their slow advance. Even by their standards, the Mongols were facing fearful numerical odds, and they were beginning to suffer terrible casualties when Subadai's force suddenly appeared to the rear of the Hungarian positions. They surged forward behind a hail of arrows, and before long, the Hungarian army had been driven back into their own camp. Now, superior numbers meant nothing. Hungarian morale began to collapse. The Hungarians were trapped in their fortified camp under a constant murderous barrage of catapult projectiles. However, the Mongols did not storm the Hungarian positions. Instead, they formed lines opposite the camp that were punctuated with gaps. Many Hungarians, seized by panic, made a frantic dash to escape through the gaps in the Mongol line, presenting easy targets for the pursuing Mongol archers, who picked them off one by one as they surged through. Some Hungarians, including the Knights Templar, chose to stand their ground and die fighting to the last man. King Bela himself managed to escape with a handful of survivors to the Croatian island of Trogir. Behind him lay an army in ruins and a battlefield soaked with blood. Of the 100,000-strong Hungarian army, 70,000 men had been killed and 25,000 had been taken captive. After a break of 8 months, the Mongols resumed their campaign on Christmas Day 1241 by advancing into western Hungary. Clearly, Austria and Croatia were firmly in their sights. The city of Zagreb was sacked and preparations were being made to besiege Vienna when fate came to take a hand.
Fortune favoured Europe because in 1241 the Khan, son of Genghis Khan, Ugadai Khan, died back in the Mongolian capital far away in Karakorum, and the Mongol generals who were leading the attack on Europe withdrew their armies and returned east to work out who would succeed Ugadai Khan as the new leader of this imperial juggernaut of the Mongolian Empire. And they took their armies with them. They might need them for a trial of strength if this dispute became violent.
And so Poland and Hungary were abandoned. Europe had been spared by pure chance. The Mongols never threatened the West again.
One of the abiding questions of history is whether the Mongols could have conquered Western Europe if the Great Khan had not died when he did. One argument is that once they run out of the grazing land, which was necessary to support a nomadic army, and you don't really find that east of the Hungarian plain, that they wouldn't have been able to maintain the logistical support. In contrast to that, if you look at the way the Mongols conquered China, they adapted within a couple of decades to fighting a fortress-based warfare, and so maybe they could have done it in the West.
But they were getting a very long way from their Asian and steppeland heartland. And at some point, what had already been conquered became an important enough prize worthy of internal dissent and squabble. So by that point, if you like, the Mongol Empire was already on the verge of breaking into its constituent parts. And that's in fact what happened over the next few decades. So maybe Europe would have been ruled by the Mongols, but there's a good chance, I think, that even if Ugadai Khan had not died, that the Mongol conquests might have stopped somewhere in Central Europe rather than
rather than running right through to the Atlantic coast.
The next war council, convened by the great Khan Manchu in 1251, decided on twin campaigns against Sung China and the Islamic empires of the Middle East. It was during the Middle Eastern campaign that a Mongol army 25,000 strong that was advancing on Egypt was met and defeated in battle. Even though they were crushed by sheer weight of numbers, such a defeat was without precedent, and the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. Under the inspired leadership of the first great Mongol leader Genghis Khan, the Mongolian Empire expanded at a rate never before witnessed in human history. Dismissed as nomad barbarians by the Islamic and Western worlds, the Mongolian army proved themselves to be adaptable, resourceful, astute, and disciplined. By the year 1300, the Mongol Empire stretched from the eastern Polish border to the Sea of Japan. Genghis Khan summed up perfectly the philosophy of the Mongolian soldier. His words provide a chilling reminder of why the Mongolian warrior was so feared by his enemies.
The greatest pleasure is to vanquish your enemies and chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth and see those dear to them bathed in tears, to ride their horses and clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters.
It was one of the most prosperous cities in the world. The waterways which punctuated the artificial islands were the highways of commerce for an empire. The rulers took tribute from towns and settlements hundreds of miles away. The knights and noblemen who ruled the place wore fine clothes, ate exotic foods, and walked the cleanest streets in the world. In 1519, the imperial city of Tenochtitlan was exciting, rich, and powerful. But a man from overseas was coming to change all that. Over the course of 2 years, a single ruthless man was able to forge an alliance which destroyed the gorgeous city, rooted out its ancient religion, and created a new realm for his king. The disease his people unwittingly brought with them would finish the job by massacring the people who remained in the Empire of Mexico. Moctezuma II, the emperor in Tenochtitlan, was concerned with signs and portents. His people, the Mexica or Aztecs, had seen a comet in the sky, and in 1518 had heard stories of strange, pale, bearded men from the coast. The Mexican religion predicted an apocalyptic time of great trouble, and his people wondered whether the time had come. Tenochtitlan was built on Lake Texcoco, high in the mountains of what is today Mexico. The city itself was built on an island in the middle of the lake, and the citizens farmed artificial islands all around. The Mexica were not a seagoing people, and they had only a vague idea that a few hundred miles across the Gulf of Mexico there were islands inhabited by the men of Spain. In the years since Christopher Columbus had come to the islands and coasts of South America, colonists from all over Spain had followed. The warring kingdoms of Spain had come together by conquest and marriage, expelled their Jews and Muslims, and now Spain looked outwards, seeking new lands to rule, to Christianize, and to milk for profit. The deputy governor of Cuba selected the 34-year-old mine owner Hernán Cortés to lead an expedition to some islands in the west. Islands which turned out to be the American mainland. Like his relative Francisco Pizarro, Cortés was the son of a poor but blue-blooded Spanish family who was making his fortune in the Caribbean.
Cortés was an educated man who went to Salamanca, who studied law. He was very much an adventurer. He had this sense of adventure very clearly in his mind. He wanted to discover new lands, and of course he wanted to improve his wealth. He knew exactly what he wanted and why he wanted to do it.
He was a good thinker in all circumstances. He could make decisions quickly. I think that he saw an opportunity. He was highly energetic, very organized, ambitious, but also wise, I think. And he was the man for that particular season. He did extremely well in the New World.
Hernán Cortés was of medium height, thin, had a thin beard and fair skin. He read and wrote Latin and had studied law. He had led a plantation owner's protest to the deputy governor about slave allocation, which made him a good man to send away. Cortés's mission was to skirt the supposed islands at the western edge of the Caribbean Sea, claiming them for Spain and making peace with the native people. He christened his men the Holy Company. With 11 ships, they would explore, seek news of past Spaniards who had disappeared, and spread the word of God.
There were only a few career paths open to those who did not themselves inherit land. There was the church, become a priest, you could become a sailor, go to sea, and you could go into royal service. So there was a requirement to find work for the younger sons in rather narrow fields. They had been schooled since childhood to seek glory, to seek prominence for themselves and for their families. And the opportunities for seeking glory had become very narrow. So there was tremendous pressure for young Spanish men to seek fame away from Spain.
The Holy Company carried with them the military traditions of Europe, and Europe was armed with gunpowder and steel. The leaders of the expedition rode horses and wore steel European armor. They carried lances and steel swords. Most of the Europeans would fight on foot. Some carried crossbows, others carried hackbutts, an early form of musket. The expedition's artillery were lightweight Lombard guns and small brass naval cannon. Early in the expedition, the Spaniards realized that they did not need steel armor to protect them from the weapons of the Mexica. For most purposes, they wore lightweight armor made from densely woven cotton, but they found that putting on the steel helmets and breastplates of Spain instilled fear in the aboriginal peoples. The Mexica were cultured and sophisticated, but they had never before seen steel. Cortés chafed under the restrictions imposed on him by the governor of Cuba. Soon after landing on the North American mainland, Cortés declared his mission accomplished, established a new colony, and under ancient Spanish law, declared that the colony was self-ruling. Cortés reached out to local rulers who feared Moctezuma, who hated paying tribute to Mexico, but were too weak to refuse.
It was fortuitous that Cortés was given as a gift a slave whom he renamed Marina, who had been trained in both the Maya and the Nahuatl language groups. And the result of that was that as Marina got better and better at speaking Spanish, she became an invaluable asset to Cortés because she could speak directly, translate directly between Cortés and any of the Nahuatl-speaking people they ran into. They became the team that controlled the interface, the linguistic interface between the Spanish and the Mexica, and that meant that Cortés himself was in country, up in the mountains, very powerful. Nobody could depose him from within his own company because nobody else could talk to the locals.
On a visit to one of these rulers, Cortés watched the tax collectors arrive from Tenochtitlan. These men wore bright cloaks of coloured feathers, sniffed special flowers reserved to the upper classes, and had slaves to whisk the mosquitoes away. The townsfolk treated them with fear and respect. Cortés subtly manipulated the visit of the tax collectors to his advantage. He convinced the local chief to imprison the tax collectors, though the local man was quaking in his boots at the prospect. Then, at night, Cortés freed 2 of the Mexican tax collectors, told them that he wanted to be friends with Moctezuma, and sent them back to Tenochtitlan. When the local chief discovered 2 of his prisoners were gone, he was ready to put the remaining Mexicans to death. Cortés intervened, suggesting that they be imprisoned aboard one of his ships instead. Cortés had turned a coastal chief against Moctezuma, had sent a powerful message of friendship to Moctezuma, and acquired important hostages, all in the course of one night. The local chief came to Cortés and told him that he and his 100,000 men would rise up against Moctezuma if Cortés would lead them. This changed Cortés's plans. Instead of making himself prosperous by setting up a gold prospecting town on the edges of the Spanish Empire, Cortés could march inland and take over the fabulously wealthy empire of Mexico.
Moctezuma was not very quick to react to the threat of the Spaniards. He was a religious man. He was very much concerned with religion, with philosophy, and in many ways he was a victim of his own philosophical and religious ideas. But he was also very keen to welcome the Spaniards. He sent messengers with all kinds of presents, which made the Spaniards even more interested in meeting him.
If you view it from an Aztec point of view, everything that went on in the meetings between Montezuma and the Spaniards made sense in the Aztec cultural system. For example, when Montezuma first met the Spaniards, he brought gifts which the Spaniards accepted and then in turn gave him gifts. And in the cultural system of the Aztecs, that meant you were not going to wage war. And in fact, by giving Montezuma gifts in the Aztec cultural system, that translated into Cortés recognizing Montezuma's sovereignty.
The coastal peoples began to rebel against Moctezuma's authority, and Cortés began to fight. The Mexicans were frightened by Cortés's 16 horses, more frightened by the Spaniards' full beards. Victory brought Cortés allies, and the coastal people thanked the Spanish men by giving them women slaves. As Cortés grew more powerful, he tried to make himself more independent from the governor of Cuba. He sent messengers to Spain, telling the king that the governor was a poor manager and demanding that his settlement at Veracruz should be considered a self-ruling Spanish town. The Cuban governor's friends in Veracruz rebelled against Cortés, and Cortés hanged or mutilated the rebels. To ensure that there could be no talk of returning to Cuba, Cortés had all his ships run aground at Veracruz and broken up. Cortés told his people that they would march inland to Tenochtitlan. In August of 1519, 300 Spaniards of the Holy Company began the journey. Their carpenter built wagons to carry supplies and guns, pulled by allies from the coast. They had about 15 horses and a pack of fighting dogs. all of which frightened the Aboriginal people. The road from Veracruz to Tenochtitlan wound upwards from the hot coastal plain, climbing 2,000 meters into the mountains. As the Spaniards marched, messengers ran across the high plains and through the mountain passes to Tenochtitlan, telling Moctezuma of Cortés's approach. Cortés came as an ambassador, they said, which shaped their welcome. If Cortés had come to make war, Moctezuma would have assembled his army, begun the new sacrifices, and assigned idols to his regiments.
The Aztecs were very familiar with war. They were great warriors. In fact, Aztec rulers had to prove themselves in the battlefield. They had to be great at warfare before they were even elected.
The Mexica's idea of honor in war was not found in a glorious death on the battlefield the way a Spanish soldier might find it. It was finding glory on the battlefield by capturing the enemy, or finding glory on the battlefield by being captured, by being taken away and sacrificed to the enemy's gods.
But for ambassadors, there needed to be no preparations for war. The Mexicans must have been comforted, for it was the wrong season for war, and fighting at the wrong time would have been difficult.
Montezuma knew that there was a group of powerful people coming up the road. But Montezuma had no way of dealing with this group of powerful people. If they were Maya, or if they were Mexica, or if they were Tlaxcalan, if they were any one of his neighbors, he would know how to deal with them. But at every turn, at every interaction between Cortés and Montezuma, Montezuma sees that something is completely wrong. He does not know how to deal with these people. Nothing that he does makes them bow to his will. He can't threaten them, he can't manipulate them, and as a result, every means that Montezuma uses to try to achieve his aims with respect to the Spaniards is ineffective.
As the Holy Company marched, the towns along the way hosted them extravagantly. Granaries were emptied to feed the Spaniards and their coastal allies, and slaves were slaughtered in sacrifices. All along the way, chiefs aided or joined the Holy Company, eager to throw off Mexican domination. At Tlaxcala, a highland kingdom proud of its independence from the Mexicans, the Holy Company first had to fight. When they saw horses, Tlaxcalan scouts fled, drawing Cortés and a few other Spanish cavalrymen after them. When Cortés caught up, the Tlaxcalans turned to fight, killing 2 horses with their razor-sharp but brittle swords. The rest of the Tlaxcalan army was waiting, thousands drawn up in battle order, their faces horribly painted.
The Mexica did not want to kill their enemies on the battlefield. They wanted their enemies to surrender, and they wanted their enemies to be marched up to the top of a pyramid and be sacrificed to their gods. So, they did not use weapons designed to kill. The Mexica used weapons designed to disable. The Mexica used clubs. You hit the guy over the head, you break the guy's knee, he can't run away, and you sacrifice him. The Mexica, therefore, did not have armor designed to protect against killing weapons. If somebody is going to threaten you with a club, well, it's no point having chain mail. Just have a big pillow, and he hits you with the club, it hits the pillow, it goes whoomp, and you live to fight another day.
The weaponry of the Aztecs, again, was geared not to kill on the battlefield, but to draw blood, because warriors were esteemed if they gave blood. So even the arrow points which they used were small, were not designed to kill, they were designed to make people bleed.
So Mexican armor and weapons were wholly unsuited to going up against the Spanish.
The Tlaxcalan soldiers attacked in lines, armed only with obsidian-bladed swords intended to wound. The Spanish, armed and armoured with steel, supported by light artillery, handguns and crossbows, killed many in the first wave before the rest of the Tlaxcalans came to grips. This style of warfare frightened the Tlaxcalans. Dying on the battlefield was alien to their way of thinking. They wanted to capture or be captured, with blood spilling on sacrificial altars in honour of their gods. For the locals, this was pointless slaughter, and they ran away. For days, Cortés fought and negotiated with the Tlaxcalans and their allies. The Spanish armour had to stop arrows, spears thrown by atlatl launchers, and some were killed and wounded. Cortés punished the Tlaxcalans by conducting a pogrom against their priests and civilian population, burning and mutilating. Astonishingly, the Tlaxcalans were cowed into supporting the Spanish. Tlaxcala joined forces with Cortés, allowing his coastal allies to return home. As the Holy Company and their Tlaxcalan allies moved closer to Tenochtitlan, they were again met by ambassadors and magicians from Moctezuma, who told Cortés to come no closer. As these emissaries walked back to the imperial city, they had visions of destruction and the burning of the city.
The Mexican religion was built on visions. And like many religions elsewhere, visions were assisted by eating hallucinogenic mushrooms. And when Montezuma is trying to deal with Cortés, and he makes apparently irrational decisions, there is a clash of cultures at work, there is a clash of paradigms at work. But just as Cortés or his party would use alcohol as part of their daily lives, Montezuma and his advisors were using hallucinogenic mushrooms as part of their daily lives, part of understanding the world around them, and part of their way of worshiping their gods.
Moctezuma's advisors told him to fight, to attack the allied army of the Spanish and Tlaxcalans before they got to the city. For a time, Moctezuma again considered going to war, but he soon resumed his old ideas. Welcome them, give them gifts, make them his friends. In early November, the Holy Company reached the shores of the Great Lake Texcoco. Tenochtitlan was on an island in the lake, and on their approach, the Spanish were able to see the city for the first time. The local chiefs welcomed Cortés as a liberator from Mexican taxation, and they fed his soldiers and allies. Tenochtitlan was connected to the mainland by causeways, and on the 8th of November 1519, Cortés took the company on the narrow way. The dogs came first, huge brindled mastiffs which frightened the Aboriginal people with their gaping mouths and slavering jaws. In front rode 4 horsemen in full metal armour, followed by the company's banner-bearer who twirled and flourished the silken colours as he marched. The rest of the Spanish followed, with Cortés riding in state as the climax of the parade. Behind Cortés marched his Aboriginal allies, armed and painted for war. The Holy Company was a frightening sight to the Mexicans, who had never seen metal armour, horses, or even the wheeled carts which brought up the rear. The city which they approached was the largest most of them had ever seen. Paris, London, Naples, and Constantinople were the only European cities which approached the scale of the imperial city of the Mexica. Moctezuma welcomed Cortés riding in a feathered litter, with Mexican noblemen sweeping the ground before him. Cortés dismounted and shook hands with the Mexican emperor. The Spanish celebrated their arrival by firing their muskets and cannon, amazing and intimidating the citizens. Moctezuma conducted his guests to an important palace in the city and made a flowery speech of welcome. Cortés took this polite speech literally as a formal submission to Spanish authority, and from that point on assumed that he was now the ruler of the Mexican Empire on behalf of the King of Spain. The Spanish spent several days as tourists in Tenochtitlan. They were lavished with gold, cloth, and slave women, and Cortés was taken to the top of the city's highest pyramid to see the center of the Mexican Empire spread out before him. Moctezuma offered Cortés his own daughter and more women for the Spanish officers. Moctezuma was trying very hard to buy off the Spanish, to get them to go away. Cortés quietly and reasonably told Moctezuma to come back to the palace where the Holy Company was quartered, and to come quietly. Moctezuma argued, trying for hours to talk them out of it, but the Spanish captains put it to him plainly: come with them, or they would kill him on the spot. Moctezuma offered his children instead, but Cortés refused. Moctezuma must come away as a prisoner. Cortés had succeeded. Moctezuma was his hostage. Moctezuma could still rule his empire, but Hernán Cortés, son of a poor foot soldier from the province of Extremadura, would rule the emperor.
Moctezuma didn't know what to do. He was demoralized. He had been humiliated by the Spaniards. He was more or less worshipped as God in his lifetime. So the fact that he had been captured, that he had been imprisoned, made him even more vulnerable.
When Montezuma first met Cortés, he was still operating on his own cultural system. Cortés had given him gifts, so he thought things were going to proceed a certain way. Didn't happen. Then he was taken captive. Cortés actually touched Montezuma, which you don't do with an Aztec ruler. So already, in a sense, his sacred space had been violated. So I would think that he was probably crushed. Everything he knew, his whole system, had disintegrated before his eyes. And you can get through those situations when you can see an out, when you have a goal, and you say, but I'm going to do this. What was he going to do? Because the rules were gone.
The Spanish consolidated their hold over the Mexican Empire. Cortés's emissaries traveled with Moctezuma's authority and were looked after by local chiefs. The empire settled into an uneasy quiet under Spanish domination, and when a group of Mexican princes plotted to get rid of the invaders, Cortés had them imprisoned. The Mexican effigies were removed from the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, and a Christian church was established instead. Cortés had started to refer to himself as Captain General and Chief Justice of New Spain, the first modern European name for the landmass that would become America. Cortés had shrugged off the authority of the deputy governor of Cuba. The governor's agents in Spain fought at court with the agents of Cortés to little effect. Gifts to the king of Mexican gold had spoken louder than the governor's legalistic arguments. The governor resorted to force. On the 5th of March, 1520, Panfilo de Narváez set sail from Cuba with 900 men to overthrow Hernán Cortés. Cortés had to take most of his force down from Tenochtitlan to fight Narváez on the coast. He defeated the new force, recruited most of Narváez's men into the Holy Company, and began the trek back to Tenochtitlan. Meanwhile, in the imperial city, the Mexicans stopped feeding the Spanish garrison. The preparations for an important festival were underway, with steaks and pans ready for the human sacrifices. When the Spaniards asked whom the preparations were for, their Tlaxcalan allies said they were to cook and to eat the Spaniards with garlic. The Mexican festival worked its way to its climax. The figures of the gods, the human sacrifices, the feathered and furred costumes were all prepared. The rosewood drums beat, and hundreds of noblemen danced. The formal course of the ritual had to be followed exactly, each dance and each sacrifice sublime in its perfection. The songs and dances followed one another in sacred order as the Spaniards and the Tlaxcalans moved to block the exits from the sacred precinct. As the Mexicans around them awaited the climactic sacrifice, the Holy Company awaited a signal. When the exits from the temple precincts were blocked, Cortés's deputy Alvarado gave the signal. "Kill," he cried, putting his plan into action. 60 of the Spaniards had been detailed to murder the dancing Mexican nobleman, while 60 would guard Moctezuma and slaughter his attendants. The dancers, the priests, then the spectators. all the Mexicans were unarmed, and they made easy prey for steel Spanish swords and razor-sharp obsidian blades. The Spaniards moved out of the temple precincts as the spectators fled for their lives. When they returned to their palace, they saw that most of Moctezuma's attendants had been killed, and the emperor was in chains with the few surviving princes. Mexican mobs surrounded the palace, threatening to burn down the doors. Spanish boats on the lake were burned to the waterline, cutting off the Holy Company's escape. The Mexicans closed off the bridges around the palace, cutting it off, and the citizens sat down and began mourning their dead.
The Aztecs wasted time. They wasted days that were very important at this time of warfare and conflict, giving their people a decent burial, which normally were very elaborate and normally took several days.
And then, for days after that, a sullen silence descends on Tenochtitlan. And the Spanish soldiers and their Tlaxcalan allies find this very disturbing. And there are visions seen. And the visions could be part of a deliberate campaign of psychological warfare, because there are demonic apparitions seen of Mexican gods and Mexican demons by the Spanish.
Cortés marched back into Tenochtitlan with the Holy Company and their Tlaxcalan allies. The city was silent. The thousands of inhabitants were indoors, mourning and planning. Cortés marched to his palace in the foreboding quiet. Cortés could not feed his soldiers without the city's food markets, and he sent Moctezuma's brother, Cuitlahuac, to demand in the emperor's name that the markets open. Cuitlahuac walked from Cortés's palace, disappeared into the city, and immediately began to organize the Mexica against the Holy Company. In the last days of June 1520, Cortés's patrols began to run into ambushes. The drawbridges across the city's canals began to rise. The Holy Company and the Tlaxcalans were trapped. The Holy Company began to fight its way out of their palace against hordes of organized Mexicans. For days they fought in the streets of Tenochtitlan, taking casualties when they left their palace and even when they stayed inside, as a hail of stones from nearby roofs kept them out of the courtyards. Fresh water began to run low, and the brackish water of Lake Texcoco had become a barrier instead of a resource.
Suddenly, fighting in Tenochtitlan, the Spanish are conducting operations in a built-up area. They're fighting in narrow streets. They're fighting house to house. So in a field, being up high on a horse might be an advantage. But in a street, when your enemy is higher than you on the roof of a building and able to throw things down at you, then it is no longer an advantage. The Spanish try to use European military technology to advantage, but their technological advantages do them no good in the confined spaces of Tenochtitlan, and it becomes a much more even battle. And an even battle is exactly the kind of battle the Spanish can't win.
In the street fighting, the Spanish soldiers saw that one of the Mexican leaders was dressed in especially gorgeous plumage and was treated reverently by the other leaders. Cortés began to realize that the Mexica had chosen a new emperor. He concluded that Cuitlahuac had convinced the citizens that Moctezuma was dead or disabled, so he arranged to display Moctezuma on the roof of the palace. There was a hush at the sight of Moctezuma on the palace roof. Then the Mexican leaders began to hurl abuse. Perhaps even before Moctezuma was able to get a word out, stones, arrows, and darts began to fly at him. Moctezuma, mortally wounded, was taken down inside the palace. He died the next morning, and Cortés butchered all his remaining princely prisoners. It was time to leave. Cortés reluctantly ordered a plan to escape the city, and the Spanish began to load up pack animals and stuff their armor with gold. By night, they set out with a portable bridge and spare timber to cross the canals. With the horses' hooves muffled, they tried to leave undetected. They crossed one canal, then another, then two more. The way seemed open to the safety of the lake shore where their horses and guns would be an advantage, when a woman drawing water saw them moving. She cried out a warning, and soon the war drums were sounding from the city's highest pyramids. The Spanish ran for the shore, while the Mexicans scrambled into their canoes and began attacking. The old Mexican ways of war were set aside, and instead of striking to wound, they struck to kill. 2 canals stood between the Spaniards and safety. The first few Spaniards made it across, and Cortés turned to help the Holy Company fight its way across the causeway. One canal was filled with Spanish and Tlaxcalan dead. Much of the Holy Company and their Tlaxcalan allies were left behind to be taken prisoner by the Mexica and made ready to be sacrificed to the gods and eaten by their captors. That sad night, La Noche Triste, was the first great defeat for Europeans in the New World. Cortés made his way towards his allies' stronghold of Tlaxcala with 400 men and 30 horses, almost all wounded. But as they straggled from village to abandoned village, the new emperor Cuitlahuac gathered his army and put it into the hands of his military deputy. At the village of Otumba, about halfway from Lake Texcoco to the safety of Tlaxcala, a large force of Mexica attacked the Holy Company. Returning to their traditional way of war after the single episode of night fighting, the Mexica swung their clubs and obsidian-bladed swords to wound and capture, not to kill. For hours, the surrounded Spaniards and Tlaxcalans fought for their lives in a grim battle of attrition. Cortés saw the new emperor's military deputy and his fellow officers in their bright feather cloaks, and he ordered a cavalry charge. 5 Spanish horsemen rode through the enemy soldiers and knocked the Mexican commander to the ground, killing him with lances. The Mexican attack disintegrated, and in the face of decisive cavalry action, the Mexicans retreated. After 10 days' retreat, the Holy Company came to the kingdom of Tlaxcala, where they were safe.
People often talk of what a small army the Spaniards had and how successful they were in conquering a huge territory. But what people often ignore is the fact that the conquest was not made by the Spaniards. The conquest was made by the Mexicans. The Mexicans actually helped the Spaniards. The Tlaxcaltecans and many other groups joined Cortés's forces and helped him destroy the Aztec Empire.
Cortés sees a tremendous threat. He has been defeated. He has been shown to be weak. He has been shown to be defeatable. So the first thing that Cortés does is he goes to the Tlaxcalans and he says, "Who would you like to destroy?" And the Tlaxcalans say, "Well, we've always hated the people in Tepeaca." And Cortés says, "All right, well, let's go destroy them." And after the defeat in Tenochtitlan, Cortés ensures that he has a very bloody victory in Tepeaca. And they march up to Tepeaca and they absolutely slaughter the locals. So what Cortés does is, out of the ashes of defeat, he arranges a victory, and Cortés rebuilds the Holy Company as a fighting entity.
Cortés and the Tlaxcalans set about pacifying the land between the Mexica and the sea, defeating the town's men in battle and branding the faces of the women and children as they were sold into slavery. Spanish settlements were planted in the conquered towns, and the territory controlled by the Spanish-Tlaxcalan alliance grew, cutting Tenochtitlan off from the coastal peoples and from the sea. Cortés's people began to build brigantias, small sailing ships which would enable the Spaniards to sail across Lake Texcoco and attack the Mexicans from the water. But by October of 1520, Cortés had a new ally: disease. The great smallpox plague, which depopulated North America and the Caribbean, started on the island of Hispaniola in 1518 and slowly spread to Cuba. Narvaez, the Spanish officer sent to rein Cortés in, probably brought the disease to the Mayan peoples in the peninsula of Yucatan, and one of Narvaez's porters brought the disease to Cortés's allies on the Mexican coast. Smallpox spread through the Aboriginal communities rapidly, killing half the population wherever it struck. Village chiefs pulled houses down on the heads of sick families, trying to contain the contagion, but instead killing the survivors of the disease. When the women who processed and cooked food were gone, the men died of hunger. In their highly organized society, men did not have the skills to mill flour and bake bread.
The Spaniards brought smallpox as early as 1519, and of course the natives, having no immunities to cope with the disease, were decimated in no time. There were about 22 million inhabitants in ancient Mexico at the time, and it's calculated that only 80 years later the population was reduced by about 90%.
It wasn't just smallpox, there were flus, and it wasn't just what the humans brought, of course, it was the animals as well. One of the first things that happened was that cattle and sheep polluted streams, and that had not existed in the New World before. So there were even microenvironments in which bacteria and other microbes could just flourish. So it was a disaster waiting to happen.
Corn stood unharvested, and even the ritual human sacrifices began to grind to a halt. The Mexican Empire was gravely weakened. Cortés, on the other hand, grew stronger. Spanish reinforcements intended for Narvaez or bent on new conquests joined the Holy Company, bringing new guns and much-needed supplies. Mexican gold went with men to Hispaniola and Jamaica to buy fresh horses and supplies of ammunition. Both Cortés and the new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, prepared for war. Cuauhtémoc offered sacrifices and prepared to muster his army for the only kind of war his people understood, a huge battle on a field where many prisoners would be taken for sacrifice to the Mexican gods. Cortés readied himself for a long campaign of siege.
Cortés knows that water is a problematical issue if you live on Lake Tenochtitlan, because Lake Tenochtitlan is not fresh water, it is brackish water, and they had to rely for water in Tenochtitlan on wells on the lake shore, with the water brought by conduit into the city. Cortés knew that if he could take the seaward side, the lakeward side of Tenochtitlan with his brigantines, and on the landward side, if he could cut the water supply, that he would fight against the Mexica from a position of advantage.
On the last day of December 1520, the reinforced Holy Company came to Texcoco. The rulers of the town, eager to rid themselves of imperial domination, welcomed Cortés and offered assistance. But many of the townsfolk took to their canoes and paddled off to warn the Mexica. Cortés took his revenge by pillaging the city and enslaving the women and children. The towns of the lake shore began to offer their submission to Cortés. At Iztapalapa, the Holy Company massacred the town's army and expelled its citizens. At Chalco, the citizens' own soldiers drove off a Mexican army. Bit by bit, the emperor was losing control of his own lake. Tribute was no longer coming in from the empire, and supplies began to run short in Tenochtitlan. Cortés divided his army into 4 divisions. 3 divisions would fight on land. Each would hold one of the causeways which connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland. 1 division would cross the lake from Texcoco in canoes and 12 brigantias, small sailing ships. Each brigantias was about 65 feet long, and each could carry between 25 and 30 men, as well as a cannon. These brigantias would destroy the Mexicans' canoes, further cutting them off from the mainland. 1 causeway would be left open as a tempting escape route. At the end of May 1521, the divisions of the Holy Company began to march, and on the 1st of June, the fleet of brigantias set sail from Texcoco. Thousands of canoes paddled out from Tenochtitlan to face thousands of canoes and 12 small ships. The guns, crossbows, and muskets of the Spaniards crashed through the Mexican fleet, and the large number of canoes filled with Cortés's lakeshore allies pushed them back into the protected canals of Tenochtitlan. Once the Emperor Cuauhtémoc saw Cortés's deployment, he split his own army into 4 divisions. 3 of them met Cortés's landward divisions, and 1 stood ready to defend the city from Cortés's brigantes. For weeks, the fighting at the causeways ground on, and the last causeway was blocked. The Mexica were cut off in their grand city.
The situation that existed in the final siege of Tenochtitlan was very different. And surely the Aztecs who were fighting must have realized that. They must have seen that it signaled the end of their empire.
Once you go to another country and you say, we are going to destroy your empire, we're going to destroy your way of life, we are going to take your religion away from you, they have no choice but to fight back with everything they've got. Cortés has to fight for every stone in that town. He has got to destroy Tenochtitlan in order to take it.
Cortés could not get the Mexica out, so he cut off the remaining causeway and ordered his brigantes to begin torching houses in Tenochtitlan. Then, on the 10th of June, Cortés began to fight his way into the depleted city. But the narrow streets were vulnerable to attack from the rooftops, so as Cortés pulled back, he torched more houses. 5 days later, Cortés forced his way into the city center again, and again he burnt what he could before retreating. The Mexica consolidated their defense in the suburb of Tlatelolco. Here they were more successful, and on June the 30th, their counterattacks were able to overwhelm the Spaniards and their allies briefly, capturing prisoners.
The Mexicans got hold of the Spaniards, sacrificed them. They practiced decapitation. They put the skull in the skull rack. They sacrificed both Spaniards and the horses of the Spaniards. And the Spaniards were shocked and terrified to recognize the faces of some of their soldiers.
This was the last celebration of the Mexica. Short of food, short of water, they never again managed to muster a major counterattack. As Cortés burnt their city around them, the Mexica stopped breaking up the causeways. They were reduced to drinking the brackish lake water and gnawing on mud bricks to get at the straw inside. On the 13th of August, 1521, it ended. The Mexicans' will to resist collapsed, and they began surrendering. The emperor, like Moctezuma before him, was permitted to rule under Cortés's control. When the Spaniards did not find the heaps of gold they expected, Emperor Cuauhtémoc was tortured by fire and crippled for life. Later, Cortés hanged the emperor for plotting a return to power. Cortés ruled like a king, for a while sending the required 1/5 of the wealth to Spain and keeping 1/5 of the remainder for himself. But then the King of Spain extended his hand to New Spain. He confirmed Cortés as governor and captain general of New Spain, but appointed a treasurer, a factor, a bookkeeper, and an inspector. All of them, Cortés included, would be on modest, fixed salaries.
This very promising New Spain that Cortés constructs, it falls apart. Everybody dies because everybody gets smallpox, and the city of Tenochtitlan is destroyed by an earthquake, and next to nothing remains of the old Mexica Empire.
As a consequence of the conquest, the Mexicans became drunkards. They were given to alcoholism. There were diseases. There was smallpox, typhus. No real prospect of a better life. They were equally slaves under the rulership of the Spaniards. So that, together with the overthrow of their cities, made them utterly depressed.
Cortés returned to Spain in 1528. Out of favor at court, he retired to Seville and died there, aged 62, in 1547. Cortés sought to take over the majesty of Tenochtitlan and make it his own. The son of a poor Spanish family wanted to carve out a golden kingdom for himself in the New World. He wanted to redeem the Mexicans and preserve a Christian version of their culture under his domination. Cortés could not know that he and his conquistadores were the leading edge of a tidal wave that would sweep up from the sea to drown forever the ancient civilizations of the New World.